joined now by Grant Afseth, who runs things for Dallas Basketball and does great work covering the Dallas Mavericks. Grant, thank you so much for hopping on. Really strong start for the Dallas Mavericks this year, kind of contrary to what we thought it would be.
Yeah, definitely. I think with that 12-day international trip, a lot of people were skeptical, including myself, that they could get off to a sluggish start. Teams typically do when they play in Europe or Asia for their preseason games. With them, it was an unprecedented amount of travel, like 12 days, two countries, multiple continents. That's a lot of, extra, I guess you could say, burden to take on and workload before you're really getting going. You don't have that like normal training camp environment where you're in your facility and really able to get extended practice opportunities. So that's like being able to be 6-2 to this point is very impressive. Granted, they haven't had a very challenging schedule. They've had some of the teams with that are rebuilding. They've had teams that have injuries, and they had their first test against the Denver Nuggets, their fifth game of the season, and they didn't pass the test on that one. They ran into Jokic and like a familiar problem with a lack of perimeter size. Aaron Gordon, Michael Porter Jr. They were very problematic matchups for Dallas. And last night they played the Toronto Raptors, and that was another similar theme where you have a team with big wings, Scotty Barnes, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, and they really struggle with them as well. So I think that's kind of a carryover problem where they made roster moves to improve in that area, with Grant Williams being at least stronger. He's not like 6'8" with that really long wingspan, so he's not like the perfect by any stretch option. But they felt like they improved, and he has made an impact. Especially shooting the ball. But overall, they're still pretty small on the perimeter with Josh Green and Derek Jones, not being the, I guess you could say like the perfect proportions, because Derek Jones has 7-foot wingspan. He's 6'6", but he's very thin. He's like 210 pounds. Josh Green's, he's got a bigger frame, but he's, closer to like the 6'5" sort of range. And,
Sure.
Neither of them are like that 6'8", 230, 225 pounds. That you really need on those like premier matchups. So that's kind of the struggle, the main issue that I've seen right now. A lot of points in the paint given up, and they've been honestly like playing off of Derek Jones to where they've been struggling to get into the paint themselves. They last 6 games I posted recently where they've basically been the least scoring paint team in the league, and they've also given up the most paint points as well. So that's probably where a lot of their problems start right there.
No, for sure. I mean, fifth in offense, that hasn't been too much of an issue. 21st in defense. I think that was really where most people thought this team would be. Just a team that was going to be elite on offense when you have Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving and a strong rim roller in Derek Lively, who's been awesome in that regard. But the 21st in defense is obviously that's going to be the glaring thing that they're going to have to improve throughout the year, but they have the capacity to do that. And we'll talk about that in future weeks as well. But I continue to be very impressed with Luka. Obviously, you know that he's got that capability in him, but even like at this MVP level, it seems like he's even improved beyond that. So what has gone into that level of improvement for him so far?
Luka's shot extremely well from 3 in a lot of his games. There's been a couple games here and there where he hasn't. Against the Raptors, he kind of relied too much on the jumper. And then I think against the Spurs in the season opener, he didn't shoot very effectively either. But he's been, again, when he shoots well from 3, it really opens things up for him. Defenses really kind of, I guess you could say, start to account for that very aggressively, where they're kind of loading up on that side, not wanting him to get the shot off, and that opens up the drive a little bit more. He is attacking the paint a little bit less overall this season than he was last season. Like if you look at drives per game, and I think part of that has to do with him kind of playing more, like a little bit more within the flow of the offense, where he's kind of spending a little bit more time off the ball as they kind of get into other actions. He's still very much like handling the ball, initiating things, and making plays in that regard, but overall, I think just been continuing to be extremely effective playing at a pick and roll. He's always going to be one of those premier isolation scorers. And he's actually taken more of those catch and shoot threes that he's kind of hesitated in the past. I was actually looking at stats on that. I think he scored about like 36 around there for total points. He had 90 all of last season. He's been like twice as frequent before this last game at taking those catch and shoot jump shots. So that's been another part that is kind of, I guess you could say, added or been more aggressive in utilizing as they integrate Kyrie Irving into the offense. But I think overall, just as they progress, kind of like maintaining an ability to get into the paint with their floor spacing and their lineups will be an important factor to monitor because teams haven't yet respected Derrick Jones at the level where they've decided we're going to stay home on him. There's been some possessions where they fully pre-rotate the low man, and there's a spray out pass to the corner, and he's wide open, and he's missing a corner three. He's had games where he's been very effective, like on the box score. You can see he scored quite a bit of points against the Raptors in double figures last game. So it's not to say that he's been ineffective, but there's times where teams are just really loading up on Luka to make him make the spray out pass and kind of picking their poison. And I think that has contributed to him driving less. But, something that I found very intriguing in some of the recent games, in the fourth quarter particularly, he's been playing a lot out of double drag screens, and they've been really aggressive, mismatch hunting, where it's really hard to switch all the time and kind of hide a defender when you bring multiple screeners into the action, as well as the weakest defender. And they've got into the 2-man game with Kyrie and Luka more in that kind of 2-minute drill, I guess you could describe it as, where Kyrie mostly does a screening for Luka, in 2-man game. But against the Magic, they had a possession that was something to really look at and build on. Was when Luka screened for Kyrie and got Cole Anthony on him, and he used his size to get to the free throw line. So those are the little things that I kind of keep an eye on and watch them as games kind of go on, and when they start with Derrick Jones and the lineup combos, and then that 2-man game. So overall, there's been some patterns I think you could say that are kind of developing with his approach, and a lot of it's very similar to what it always has been because he's going to dominate the ball a lot. But just those little nuances I'll keep an eye on for sure. And, as they kind of progress throughout the rest of the season. And, Kyrie, one thing I'll add as well is that he's mentioned that he took time off this offseason, 30 to 40 days, I believe he said, uncharacteristically. And he's kind of eased into the season. He hasn't been dominating the ball by any stretch. And that's something to really monitor with how Luka kind of gets utilized, because the more, they get into actions that simplify the game for Luka, with Kyrie initiating, makes things, obviously easier for him, for both parties involved. But I think there's still a time where Kyrie has to kind of get into the in-season rhythm, because he mentioned between his injuries that we talked about, with his groin, on the last episode where he had a groin injury in preseason, and then he had a foot sprain that caused him to miss a couple games recently. He hasn't really had that extended run to get into that rhythm and then to add layers to their offense. So those are all things to kind of take into consideration with how it relates to Luka's impact. I guess you could say impressive start to the season and how it looks going ahead.
No, there's no doubt, and I mean, there's a lot of layers there. There's a lot of things that we could really kind of pick at, and we'll continue to pick at over the course of this year, and just we'll continue to track whether teams are closing out on Derrick Jones. And that's one where I don't really expect that to change that much for obvious reasons. I know the teams they're going to commit to Luka if they have to choose between one of the two. They're just going to force a guy like Derrick Jones, who has really struggled to shoot throughout his career. And maybe that's something that as we've talked about with the Mavericks, they need to come up with options that can do both the defense and the offense that they're looking for. I know that Derrick Jones Jr. is the defensive option for them in a lot of ways. Josh Green also kind of a defensive option, but can do both. And then Derek Lively, they want for his defensive impact as well. But I kind of look at this group and I look at the players that they have assembled so far. Haven't seen a ton of Maxi Kleber yet. Grant Williams is going to be in all of the closing lineups. He has been tremendous for Dallas so far this year. Just the connection that he has with Luka on those kick-out passes has been great to see. And he's a good impact defender as well. So it would not surprise me if they, like we talked about in the preseason, they'll continue to search for whoever that other guy is that they can add to the group and can bolster a lot of their lineups. But I look at a guy like Maxi Kleber, Tim Hardaway Jr., Josh Green, Derrick Jones, Derek Lively. They've got options. And I think that's one of the reasons why they've started 6-2 is that they've been able to go to those guys frequently enough that they are going to be just fine. So we will see what happens. Is there one thing that you're expecting to kind of be a little bit of a regression here that has like they've started 6-2? Is there something that might come back down to earth for them over the course of these next couple weeks?
Yeah, I think they have a lot of shooting talent, especially with like Tim Hardaway off the bench as one of their complementary options. And they have like, two superstars to be able to utilize like with staggered minutes to kind of make the most of his shooting ability with playmaking to set him up for opportunities. But I think in general, the team as a whole, there will be nights where they don't shoot very well from three. And when that happens, they've shown that their inability to contain in the paint and also get to the paint at a high rate that's kind of been a problem where, like against the Raptors, they even were shooting well from three, and they still, with their struggles in the paint on both ends, ended up being too much to overcompensate for. And that's something without Derek Lively in the lineup that really shows they're relying on him a lot. So having him back in the fold potentially soon as he recovers from an illness that's unclear exactly when it'll be because he's questionable for tomorrow's game against the Clippers. But overall, how like Derek Lively continues to play through foul trouble at times, how he handles avoiding fouls, all that sort of thing will be huge factors for their overall success because there's been nights where he has gotten into quick foul trouble and that's really limited the ability to fully like utilize him as an extended option at the five. And if he can continue to get comfortable with the NBA, develop and minimize those nights. And the team, basically like has some of those nights where they're not hitting from three. I think Derek Lively's impact on both ends will be very important for opening things up offensively as a roller, and involving him in that like the double drag screening actions late in games where he's the rim roller and they have the shooting threat as the first screener. That's an important part of how they close games, and having him available is a big part of being able to close games with him. Both health wise and foul trouble wise. And then the obvious thing as well is like the impact on the boards. He's been a very impressive offensive rebounder, but he's also been a very impressive, overall paint protector. If you see the impact per 100 possessions that they've had, in terms of like differential with points in the paint that they've allowed, there's a big difference. I think it's over 8 points per 100 possessions versus like when he's on the floor compared to when he's off. So they really need him as much as possible to be on the floor, just in general. So all that basically into one factor where Derek Lively's continued development will kind of help them insulate themselves from off shooting nights. But they still, even when they do shoot well from three, they're very reliant on Derek Lively's impact to be able to make basically raise the floor of their team in other areas, which is very concerning, I guess, in a way, because it's a 19-year-old. Like he's a well beyond his years in wisdom. Like when you talk to him, but it's still a 19-year-old that's playing matchups for the first time. Like when we were in Denver, covering that game together, we saw that. Like he had to face Jokic for the first time in the really difficult to match up against Nuggets offense. Like that's a lot of stuff to see for the first, second, third time throughout a one season where you're really learning. I don't care if you went to Duke, how smart you are. Like that can be challenging for anybody like trying to take on that task. So I think his development will be very important, and just having more ways where you can continue to make an impact and overcome those off shooting nights will be key. But they've very much been a live or die by the three team, as that's kind of been the case throughout the Luka era. Like even when they went to the Western Conference Finals run, they really just shot teams out of the gym to get past like Utah, Phoenix, and then that kind of stopped. That momentum stopped against Golden State, and here we are today, where they are kind of in a similar situation where they can't really control the paint on both ends, even with how great Luka is at getting into the paint and making plays. So that would be something to definitely monitor, how they kind of build that identity, if you will, where they improve as a paint team on both ends and they don't rely so much on the threes. But overall, when you have that cold stretch from three, as any team tends to have, I think they'll be more prone to the downside than other teams, if that makes sense, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense, and it is something tough to rely upon. But as we talked about at the beginning of the year, it was going to go probably one of two ways. It was either going to be way better than expected or way worse than expected. And so far, I still think it's been way better. I think it's a positive thing that can be taken, and hopefully they can build upon that in the future. You mentioned we'll wrap up with this here. You mentioned the Mavericks coming to Denver. and then sort of that welcome to the NBA moment for Derek Lively specifically. Was that the best player, best team combination that you've seen so far?
Yeah, that's definitely has been for sure. I think everything else has kind of been those, like, I guess you could say, like, typically losing teams or rebuilding teams, and then the Raptors that are still trying to figure it out for themselves. Like Scotty Barnes was very impressive this season, and Siakam is all NBA player as well, and then OG Anunoby is a defensive player of the year candidate. So that's a talented team, but definitely not like the unified approach that you get from Denver, who I feel like when things click, they do pretty well, like win a title. So that's definitely been
There.
a very challenging opponent. When you kind of look at the schedule, that definitely stands out as the one to circle for sure. Yeah, I think definitely the best player would be Nikola Jokic. He was just phenomenal in the game that I saw. He just controls the game in a way you don't really see from many players. Like, it comes within the flow so easily for him too. Like it's so hard to account for switching against him. If you get a small on him, you got to send help, and he's just finding the open teammate. And he's just been exceptional in the paint with his efficiency as well too. Like, no matter, like I've seen other games as well too, where he's had some matchups where really long defenders are still trying to crowd his space, and he's getting a touch shot over the top and converting at a very high clip. So that's just an extremely hard player to account for when they can score dominantly and pass dominantly as well. And you have all that talent with shooting and cutting around him. I think they're just particularly a very challenging team with that dominant center, with a rookie center who's trying to figure that one out each time they play, and just like not having the size on the perimeter to account for their relief options. That's a really brutal task to have when you're like I remember a possession, like not to get too deep into it, obviously, but like they were helping, like ball watching with Jokic having the ball in the paint, and in the dunker spot they already had like Aaron Gordon standing there, and he just like split second just whips the ball to him, and they just don't have the size. He has the defender sealed on his back, like the help defender who's helping the helper, and it's just an easy finish from that point on. Like little things like that. It's just if you don't have the size, you don't have the size uh, to be able to handle those things, and that they're just such a well built team. It's going to be fascinating to see them play out the rest of their season and how the Mavericks try to handle them as well.
We'll see which teams can kind of match up with Denver and Jokic. That's going to be a challenge for, I think, for the rest of the NBA. Maybe it's Boston, maybe it's Milwaukee, maybe it's Phoenix. Who knows? But going to be fascinating to see. Actually, Minnesota already did a number on them too. So we'll see if that's a matchup to kind of play around with as well. But he's Grant Afseth of Dallas Basketball. Grant, thank you so much for chatting with me. Really do appreciate you taking the time. I'll chat again with you in 6 weeks. All right.
Yeah, it sounds good. I look forward to our next conversation. I appreciate it.